Hi, my name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Thank you for watching. So today we're going to be talking about budget cuts in government because no matter what happens with the coronavirus, depending on how quickly we get out of this, the only question that is going to be on anybody's mind after that, as far as how it affects local government, is exactly how much this is going to reduce tax revenue. And it is going to reduce tax revenue. There's no way around that. Let's just talk about Washington State in general. Now, if you look at this chart here, this is actually a report from Washington State's Department of Revenue that analyzes sources of tax revenue in Washington State. And as you see from this chart, a huge majority of Washington State revenue sources actually do come from B&O tax, or they come from sales tax. So sales tax on the sale of goods, and B&O tax, which is basically a gross receipts tax that's imposed on businesses and just their gross receipts of their business. And local business is in a tailspin right now because of the shelter-in-place requirements from the governor, and nationally, and basically the reason that so many of these businesses are shut down right now, they're literally generating no revenue at all. The sales tax receipts are going to substantially be less because even though people flooded Costco to buy a lot of food and other products, the reality is that food is not, you don't pay sales tax on food in Washington State, so that doesn't generate any revenue to the state. And no matter how many truckloads of toilet paper people buy in a panic buying mode, that isn't going to produce enough sales tax revenue to make up for the fact that people are not buying cars. There's not as much property being sold, which is an excise tax that would go to the state normally. There's not as much timber like this being sold right now, so there's less taxes that are brought into the state from that. Just a lot of things are going to be, there's going to be a lot less tax revenue. This is a pretty big impact on local government, and state government and local government's not really used to having cuts like this. And yet they're going to have some, and they're probably going to be quite dramatic. Depending on who you talk to and the budget projections, we could be looking at a 25 to 30% cut in Washington State's budget in the way of tax revenues. And unlike the federal government, we don't have the ability just to print money or run trillion-dollar surpluses. The budget has to be balanced in Washington State, and the reality is that we just can't print our own money. So there's going to have to be cuts that are made. There's no choice about this. And these cuts are going to have to be quite significant. If you look at this chart here, this is also from the Department of Revenue, and this shows over the last 18 years, roughly, the changes in tax revenue in Washington State. You can kind of see it going up and down, and there's, during the 2008 crisis, the housing crisis, you saw that taxes kind of peaked in 2006, and then you had several years, 3 years in a row, of substantial drop in revenue tax revenue to Washington State. It ended up, in total, was about 20% tax revenue drop over those 3 years, and it got to 8% less than what the tax had been collected in 2000, 9 years earlier. So it took a number of years for it to come out of that, and people who work in government do remember some of the cuts that were imposed then. However, it's likely this is going to be a lot worse. So the question is, what do you cut in local government? And there are some obvious things in Washington State that clearly do need to be cut. One of them would be things like the Evergreen State College, and we've talked about it before. It's a failed educational experiment, and there's not going to be any more room in the budget to handle just failed experiments. Money has to be spent on higher priorities. That is not a high priority anymore in Washington State. Eliminating Evergreen College is an obvious one of just a simple thing that needs to be cut. However, before I go any further, too, the one thing I'm going to mention is that one thing, all these elected officials and senior level bureaucrats have all had pay raises, fairly substantial ones over the last few years, and those pay raises need to be cut, or at least they need to be rolled back, or if that's too difficult, some kind of across-the-board cut that's very substantial should be done, if nothing else, to demonstrate from the governor down to the legislature and the senior level bureaucrat positions that these cuts are serious, and that they're going to share in some way the pain that is basically going to be inflicted on local government in the fact that they're going to have to make these cuts. Demonstrating it with your own payroll cuts as a first step is important, and I think that's probably the first thing they need to do. And then get rid of places like Evergreen State College, which is useless, Puget Sound Partnership, which just started as a nepotistic kickback scheme that spends most of its money in existence justifying its own existence, not really solving or helping the environment at all, and significant cuts in places like the Department of Ecology and Fish and Wildlife, And I write more about that in an article that's attached down below if you want to see some of the details. However, no cuts in Washington State are realistic without looking at the two largest consumers of Washington State's budget. And that's going to be the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is basically public education, and also DSHS, which is the Department of Social Health Services. And so these two big state agencies really consume the lion's share of the state budget. It goes one way or another into these two different agencies. And so cuts in these two agencies are going to happen. The reason why I specifically want to talk about upper management cuts is that the tendency is that when an agency is forced to look at cuts, what they oftentimes do is retain these upper managers and then try to cut frontline staff, which is the wrong way to approach genuinely serious cuts that we have to make in government right now. The cuts should be focused on really streamlining and eliminating some of the middle management and upper management positions and retain as much as possible the frontline people who are actually doing the real work in government. And that is just going to be difficult for these agencies to adapt to from a cultural standpoint, and they're mostly going to probably be finding some excuse to keep various managers or political appointees in place, and yet those are the areas that need to be cut most. Now, when we talk about Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, what we really mean is trying to focus on the prototypical school budget model and look at the OSPI office itself, the one that basically there are no teachers there. It's just the bureaucrats in Olympia, starting with elected Superintendent Chris Reichtel and on down. That whole department needs a substantial cut. All of the outreach, curriculum development, propaganda sort of departments need to be eliminated, and they need to be just focused on education. None of the extracurricular sort of things that they've shoved into that bureaucracy. But the real cuts are probably going to have to come at the ESD level, which is the educational service districts. There's a number of them scattered around the state, and ostensibly they provide some good services actually for local school districts. You got about 295, I believe, school districts around the state, and they're roughly in that number. And so those school districts use these ESDs as a way to do group purchasing, manage HR, and also manage like legal services. And that makes sense so that a number of districts can actually kind of pool their resources and get better purchasing, better support for something that they don't need to pay for all the time, or they can basically reduce those costs. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is a lot of the bureaucrats that work in these departments, and that's going to be where pretty substantial cuts have to be made. I detail some of those a little bit in the article attached below. And DSHS is kind of the next big focus. Some major cuts are going to have to come there. And one thing to remember about DSHS is that largely it's a clearinghouse for both federal and state welfare payments, largely. Just it kind of flows through that department, and they distribute these checks to recipients, basically recipients of various programs. And they can still retain that function that they have currently, but they're going to have to eliminate a lot of their non-essential, non-core functions that don't deal explicitly with just that distribution of those funds to recipients. And there's going to be a tendency, of course, of these agencies to resist it. There's a lot more coming on this, but some serious thought has to go into the cuts that have to happen. One of the problems that we have in Washington State and local government in general is that over the years, we have not elected a lot of people who tend to care that much about staying in the lines of the budget or even paying much attention to it. In fact, many of them are quite math challenged in general. And this is going to be very difficult and very different for them to even think about making cuts, because usually they're responding to lobbyist pressure or pressure from other special interests to keep kicking out more grants and more money to all kinds of different special programs. And it's really fun when you're a politician or a bureaucrat to be able to do that. But now we're in a completely different situation where the change is going to have to be very different. It's not going to be very fun. These are serious times. They require serious elected officials to make serious decisions. And this isn't going to be easy, but it has to be done. It has to be done quickly, because the sooner they make these cuts, the easier it is going to be for us to come out and transition out of this situation. And they don't have the option of just raising more taxes. With the economy in probably a very difficult situation for a number of years, they aren't going to be able to just continue to soak the taxpayer. There's not going to be that much room to soak the taxpayer anymore. They're going to have to find cuts. And so the article I've attached below will detail some of those cuts, and I plan on doing a series of videos that actually detail with a lot more specifics on cuts that can be made in different agencies that we would just have to make those cuts now, and we have to do them as quickly as possible. So in a special session that Governor Inslee might call, or certainly the next legislative session for sure, we need to make these cuts, and we need to make them quickly, and we need to make them significant, and they may just be the beginning. We may actually see a substantial reduction of revenue that's going to require us to do a lot more. So with that, please add your thoughts about what you think could be cut in the state budget. I like those comments. Please add them below. I appreciate the fact that you're watching We the Governed right now in kind of a weird setting where we're sheltering in place during this coronavirus outbreak. But do put those comments in. I do read them, and tell me what parts of state government that you believe should be cut.